I was lying in that hospital bed, machines beeping around me, when I heard my mother's voice through the thin walls. The insurance policy was worth $2 million, but we need to make sure she doesn't wake up to tell anyone what really happened on those stairs. My own sister's response chilled me to the bone. Don't worry, Mom. The doctor said the head injury was severe enough that even if she survives, she might not remember anything. What happened next would shatter everything I thought I knew about family loyalty, but it would also teach me the most important lesson of my life. Sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up showing you just how indestructible you really are. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Hayes, and 6 months ago, I believed I was living the American dream. At 28, I had built a thriving marketing consultancy in downtown Phoenix, owned a beautiful Spanish-style home in the Arcadia neighborhood, and maintained what appeared to be a close relationship with my family. My father, Robert Hayes, had been a successful insurance executive who died unexpectedly of a heart attack when I was 25, leaving behind a considerable estate and a family that seemed bound together by love and shared memories of his generous spirit. The Hayes family had always been the picture of middle-class success and traditional values. My mother, Margaret, had spent 30 years as a devoted wife and homemaker, channeling her considerable intelligence and organizational skills into creating the perfect domestic environment for our family. She was the type of woman who remembered every birthday, organized elaborate holiday celebrations, and maintained friendships that spanned decades. Her dedication to family appeared absolute, and she had raised my sister Caroline and me with consistent messages about the importance of loyalty, hard work, and maintaining close family bonds regardless of external circumstances. Caroline, 2 years younger than me, had followed a path that seemed to validate our mother's traditional values. She married her college sweetheart, David Chen, immediately after graduation and dedicated herself to raising their 2 children while supporting David's career as a pediatric nurse. Their suburban life in Tempe appeared idyllic from the outside: carefully maintained lawn, involvement in school activities, regular family gatherings that reinforced our sense of connection and shared purpose. Caroline had always been the more conventionally feminine of the 2 sisters, embracing domestic responsibilities with enthusiasm while expressing admiration for my professional achievements. The family dynamic had shifted significantly following our father's death, but initially in ways that seemed to strengthen our bonds rather than strain them. Dad had been the financial anchor of our extended family, helping with everything from Caroline's mortgage payments to Mom's household expenses to my business startup costs. His unexpected passing forced us to restructure our relationships around mutual support rather than dependence on his generosity. I naturally assumed greater financial responsibility for Mom's welfare, helping with her mortgage and providing supplemental income that allowed her to maintain the lifestyle she had enjoyed during Dad's lifetime. My own success had accelerated dramatically in the 3 years since Dad's death. Hayes Marketing Solutions had grown from a one-person operation run from my kitchen table into a firm employing 12 people and serving clients throughout the Southwest. We specialized in digital marketing strategies for small and medium-sized businesses, helping family-owned companies compete effectively against larger corporations with substantial advertising budgets. The work was challenging and fulfilling, requiring creative problem-solving and relationship-building skills that seemed to come naturally to me. The financial rewards of my professional growth had allowed me to become something of a family patriarch, despite my relatively young age. I had helped Caroline and David purchase a larger home when their second child was born, provided the down payment for Mom's new car when her old one became unreliable, and established college funds for my niece and nephew. These contributions felt natural and appropriate, a way of honoring Dad's memory by continuing his tradition of family generosity. Everyone expressed gratitude for my support, and the financial assistance seemed to strengthen rather than complicate our relationships. My personal life had been less successful than my professional achievements, though I attributed this to the demanding nature of building a business rather than any fundamental incompatibility with romantic relationships. I had dated several men seriously over the years, but none of the relationships had developed into the kind of partnership that would justify the compromises necessary for marriage. My work required irregular hours, frequent travel, and intense focus that many men found difficult to accommodate. I told myself that the right person would understand and support my ambitions, though privately I sometimes wondered whether my professional success intimidated potential partners or whether my high standards were unrealistic. The family gatherings that occurred monthly at Mom's house had become important anchors in my otherwise unpredictable schedule. These Sunday dinners followed a comfortable routine that had evolved over the years since Dad's death. Caroline would arrive with the children and a covered dish. David would help Mom with any household projects that required masculine expertise, and I would provide updates about my business activities and recent travels. The conversations were warm and supportive, focused on family news, community events, and shared memories that reinforced our sense of connection and continuity. Mom had begun expressing concern about my unmarried status during these gatherings, though her comments were always framed as loving worry rather than criticism. She would mention eligible men she had met through her church or social activities, suggest that I might be more open to relationships if I traveled less for work, or observe that my biological clock was ticking and I should not postpone serious consideration of marriage and children indefinitely. Her advice felt intrusive at times, but I understood it as evidence of her genuine care for my happiness and fulfillment. Caroline's role in these family dynamics was consistently supportive and encouraging. She would defend my career choices when Mom's concerns became too pointed, expressing admiration for my independence and professional achievements while acknowledging that different women found fulfillment through different paths. Her marriage appeared stable and happy, and she often spoke about the satisfaction she derived from domestic life and child-rearing. Our different choices seemed to complement rather than compete with each other, creating a family dynamic that accommodated various approaches to feminine success and happiness. The financial arrangements that supported our family structure had become increasingly complex over the 3 years since Dad's death, though I had not paid careful attention to the details. Mom's expenses seemed to increase annually despite her fixed income from Dad's pension and Social Security benefits. Caroline and David's financial needs had grown as their children became involved in expensive activities, and their household expenses expanded to accommodate a larger home and more sophisticated lifestyle. My contributions had increased correspondingly, and I had begun to feel somewhat burdened by the expectation that my success should automatically translate into financial support for other family members. The conversations about money had become more frequent and more direct over the months preceding the incident that would change everything. Mom had mentioned needing a new roof. Caroline had requested help with private school tuition for their oldest child, and both of them had suggested that I should consider establishing more formal financial arrangements that would provide security for the family in case something happened to me. These discussions made me uncomfortable, but I attributed my unease to natural reluctance to confront mortality and the complexity of estate planning, rather than any suspicion about their motivations. The suggestion that I should increase my life insurance coverage had come up repeatedly during these family financial discussions. Mom pointed out that my death would eliminate the family's primary source of supplemental income, leaving Caroline and the children particularly vulnerable since David's nurse salary was sufficient for basic needs but provided little cushion for emergencies or opportunities. Caroline had echoed these concerns, suggesting that a responsible single person should carry substantial life insurance to protect family members who had become accustomed to their support. The insurance conversation had become more pressing following a minor car accident I experienced in January. A drunk driver had run a red light and struck my vehicle while I was returning from a client meeting in Tucson. The damage was primarily cosmetic, and I had suffered only minor whiplash and bruising, but the incident had frightened my family and sparked lengthy discussions about my vulnerability as someone who traveled frequently for work. Mom and Caroline had used the accident as evidence that I needed to take estate planning more seriously, arguing that my family's financial security should not depend entirely on my continued health and safety. I had eventually agreed to increase my life insurance coverage from $500,000 to $2 million, though the decision felt premature and somewhat morbid. The insurance agent, a family friend who had handled Dad's policies, assured me that the coverage was appropriate for someone with my income level and family responsibilities. The premiums were substantial but manageable, and the peace of mind seemed worth the expense if it addressed my family's legitimate concerns about financial security. The policy had been in effect for 3 months when the incident occurred that would reveal the true nature of my family's interest in my welfare. Looking back, I can identify warning signs that should have alerted me to potential problems, but at the time, each individual concern seemed reasonable and loving. Mom's increasing anxiety about my safety, Caroline's detailed questions about my insurance coverage, and their collective pressure for me to establish formal estate planning documents appeared to reflect genuine care for my well-being and responsible concern for family financial security. The morning of March 15th began like countless others, with routine preparations for a day of client meetings and project management tasks. I had scheduled a lunch appointment with a potential new client, followed by an afternoon session with my team to review campaign strategies for our largest account. The work was engaging and challenging, requiring the kind of creative problem-solving that had attracted me to marketing in the first place. I felt energized and optimistic about the business prospects we were developing and the financial stability that would allow me to continue supporting my family while building long-term wealth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mom had called that morning to invite me for dinner, mentioning that Caroline and David would be joining us, and that she had prepared my favorite meal of beef tenderloin and roasted vegetables. The invitation was typical of her thoughtful gestures, and I had accepted gratefully since my schedule had been particularly demanding recently, and I had missed the previous 2 family gatherings due to work commitments. Family dinner represented a welcome opportunity to relax and reconnect with the people who mattered most to me. The afternoon had proceeded normally, until I received a text from Mom around 3 o'clock, asking me to stop by her house before dinner to help move some furniture. She explained that she had purchased a new bookshelf and wanted to rearrange her living room before Caroline and the children arrived. The request seemed routine, and I had planned to arrive early anyway to spend individual time with her before the family gathering became more chaotic and social. Mom's house in the Biltmore area had been the family home for over 20 years. A 2-story Mediterranean-style structure with tile floors, arched doorways, and a dramatic spiral staircase that connected the main living areas to the bedrooms above. Dad had chosen the house primarily for its investment potential and prestigious location, but Mom had transformed it into a warm and welcoming space through careful decorating and meticulous maintenance. The staircase had always been a striking architectural feature, with wrought iron railings and tile steps that created an elegant focal point for the entry hall. I arrived at Mom's house around 4:30, parking in the circular driveway and entering through the front door as I had thousands of times throughout my adult life. The familiar sense of furniture polish and the lavender sachets Mom placed throughout the house greeted me with comfortable associations of family warmth and security. Mom called out from the kitchen that she would join me in a moment, suggesting that I go ahead and assess the furniture situation in the living room while she finished preparing ingredients for dinner. The new bookshelf was positioned against the far wall of the living room, still in its packaging and obviously requiring assembly before it could be useful. I examined the instruction manual and component pieces, calculating that the project would require at least 2 hours of careful work to complete properly. The timing seemed problematic since Caroline and David were expected within 90 minutes, but I assumed that Mom had underestimated the complexity of the task when she requested my help. The conversation that followed would haunt me for months afterward, though its significance only became clear much later. Mom emerged from the kitchen with a concerned expression, explaining that she had just received a call from Caroline, indicating that David was feeling ill and they might need to postpone the family dinner. The cancellation seemed disappointing, but not particularly unusual, since minor illnesses frequently disrupted family plans, especially during cold and flu season. Actually, Mom said thoughtfully, maybe this is a good opportunity to tackle a bigger project. I've been wanting to move that heavy chest from my bedroom to the guest room upstairs, but it's too much for me to handle alone. Would you mind helping me with that instead of the bookshelf? The request seemed reasonable, and I agreed to help with the furniture relocation. We climbed the spiral staircase together, discussing family news and upcoming plans, while Mom led me toward her bedroom. The chest she wanted to move was indeed substantial, a solid wood piece that Dad had purchased during their early marriage, and that held sentimental value despite its impractical size and weight. Moving it would require careful coordination to navigate the narrow hallway and the staircase without damaging either the furniture or the house. What happened next occurred so quickly that I still struggle to reconstruct the sequence of events with complete accuracy. We had positioned ourselves on opposite sides of the chest and were attempting to lift it when I felt a sudden, violent shove against my back. The force was unexpected and powerful, sending me stumbling toward the staircase with no opportunity to regain my balance or grab the railing for support. The sensation of falling seemed to last forever, though the actual descent probably occurred within seconds. The impact with the tile steps was brutal and immediate. I remember the sound of my head striking the hard surface, a crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of the house. Pain exploded through my skull and neck, followed immediately by a strange floating sensation that I later understood was the onset of unconsciousness. The last thing I remember from that moment was the sight of Mom's face peering down at me from the top of the staircase, her expression strangely calm for someone who had just witnessed a serious accident. The period between the fall and my awakening in the hospital remains a complete blank in my memory. According to the medical records I later obtained, Mom had called 911 approximately 20 minutes after my fall, explaining to the dispatcher that she had discovered me unconscious at the bottom of her staircase and assuming that I had fallen while carrying something heavy. The emergency responders found me in critical condition, with severe head trauma, multiple fractures, and internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. The surgery lasted 6 hours, during which doctors worked to relieve pressure on my brain, repair damage to my skull, and stabilize the internal injuries that threatened my survival. The prognosis was uncertain, with medical staff explaining to my family that the next 72 hours would be critical in determining whether I would recover consciousness, and if so, what level of brain function might remain intact. Mom and Caroline maintained a bedside vigil during this period, presenting themselves as devoted family members devastated by my unexpected accident. I regained consciousness on the third day, though my awareness returned gradually and incompletely. The hospital room seemed foreign and frightening, filled with medical equipment that I did not recognize, and staffed by nurses who spoke to me with professional kindness but no personal familiarity. The physical pain was overwhelming and constant, affecting every part of my body in ways that made simple movements feel impossible. More disturbing was the cognitive confusion that made it difficult to understand where I was or what had happened to me. Mom and Caroline were present when I first opened my eyes, their faces showing relief and concern that appeared genuine and appropriate. They explained gently that I had fallen down the stairs at Mom's house and suffered serious injuries that required surgery and extended hospitalization. Their version of events seemed plausible, and I had no reason to question their account since my own memories of the incident were completely absent. The medical staff confirmed that memory loss was common following severe head trauma, and that my recollections might return gradually over time. The conversation I overheard 3 days later would shatter my understanding of everything that had preceded my hospitalization and transform my perception of the people I had trusted most completely. I was drifting in and out of consciousness, heavily medicated and unable to move without assistance, when I became aware of voices in the hallway outside my room. The words penetrated my drugged haze slowly, but their meaning was unmistakable and devastating. The insurance policy was worth $2 million, but we need to make sure she doesn't wake up to tell anyone what really happened on those stairs. My mother's voice was calm and matter-of-fact, discussing my potential death with the same tone she might use to plan a dinner menu. The shock of recognition was followed immediately by Caroline's response, equally chilling in its casual acceptance of my expendability. "Don't worry, Mom. The doctors said the head injury was severe enough that even if she survives, she might not remember anything. And if she does start to remember, we can always say she's confused from the brain trauma." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but I was too stunned to process the additional details they discussed. The realization that my own mother and sister had conspired to kill me for insurance money was too enormous and impossible to accept immediately. I lay in that hospital bed, unable to move or speak, while the people who were supposed to love me most planned how to ensure that their attempted murder would remain successful. The hours that followed were the darkest of my life. I was trapped in a broken body, dependent on the very people who had tried to destroy me, with no way to seek help or protection from further harm. The physical pain of my injuries was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of understanding that my entire family structure had been built on lies and manipulation. Everything I had believed about love, loyalty, and security had been revealed as an elaborate deception designed to position me as a victim for their financial benefit. But as I lay there in that hospital bed, something began to grow inside me that was stronger than fear or despair. It was a fierce determination to survive, to recover, and to ensure that justice was served for their betrayal. I did not know how I would accomplish these goals, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would not allow their greed to define the final chapter of my story. The woman who had fallen down those stairs was gone forever, but the woman who was beginning to emerge from that hospital bed would prove to be far more dangerous to their plans than they could possibly imagine. The relationship between Victoria Hayes and her family had been built on what appeared to be genuine affection and mutual support, but the foundation had been carefully constructed to serve purposes that Victoria would not understand until she was lying broken at the bottom of her mother's staircase. To comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal that nearly cost Victoria her life, it is necessary to examine the years of manipulation and calculated deception that preceded the moment when Margaret Hayes pushed her eldest daughter toward what she hoped would be a fatal fall. Margaret Hayes had married Robert Hayes in 1987, with expectations shaped by the economic prosperity and traditional gender roles that characterized middle-class American life during the late 20th century. She was 24 years old, college-educated but without clear career aspirations, and she viewed marriage to a successful insurance executive as the pathway to security and social respectability that she had been raised to pursue. Robert was 12 years her senior, established in his profession, and eager to create the family life that his own demanding career schedule had previously prevented him from pursuing. The early years of their marriage had fulfilled Margaret's expectations in most respects. Robert's income provided comfortable suburban living, annual vacations, and the domestic stability that allowed Margaret to focus on creating the perfect home environment. She approached marriage and motherhood with the same systematic intelligence that had made her an excellent student, treating domestic responsibilities as projects that could be mastered through careful research and disciplined execution. Her efforts produced a household that operated with impressive efficiency and created genuine happiness for the family members who benefited from her organizational skills and attention to detail. The birth of Victoria in 1995 had been followed by Caroline's arrival in 1997, completing the family structure that Margaret had envisioned since childhood. She devoted herself to motherhood with intensity that bordered on professional dedication, reading extensively about child development, implementing educational activities that would maximize her daughter's potential, and creating family traditions that would provide lasting memories and strong emotional bonds. Her approach to parenting was informed by her understanding that children require consistent love and guidance to develop into successful adults. Robert's career continued to flourish throughout the early years of their marriage, with promotions and salary increases that allowed the family lifestyle to expand correspondingly. They purchased the Mediterranean-style house in Biltmore when Victoria was 5 years old, establishing the domestic base that would serve as the setting for family gatherings and holiday celebrations for the next 2 decades. Margaret's role as household manager became increasingly sophisticated as their financial resources grew, encompassing everything from interior decorating and social entertaining to investment planning and educational consulting for the children. The marriage that had begun with mutual affection and shared goals gradually evolved into a partnership that served both parties' needs while maintaining surface harmony that satisfied their social and family obligations. Robert found in Margaret a wife who managed domestic responsibilities with professional competence, allowing him to focus entirely on career advancement without concern for household details or child-rearing logistics. Margaret found in Robert a husband who provided financial security and social status while respecting her intelligence and supporting her role as family matriarch. The relationship dynamics that would later prove dangerous were established during these supposedly happy years. Margaret's identity became increasingly dependent on her role as the family's emotional center and primary decision-maker regarding all matters that affected household welfare. She took pride in her ability to anticipate problems before they developed, to manage family finances with careful attention to long-term planning, and to maintain relationships with extended family and community members that enhanced the Hayes family's reputation and social standing. Robert's approach to family leadership was characterized by delegation rather than direct involvement. He trusted Margaret's judgment regarding domestic decisions and rarely questioned her recommendations about spending priorities, educational choices for the children, or social commitments that affected the family's time and resources. His confidence in her abilities was genuine and well-founded, but it also established patterns of authority and responsibility that would persist long after his death made such arrangements inappropriate and potentially dangerous. Victoria's childhood had been shaped by Margaret's ambitious vision of proper child development and family cohesion. Margaret enrolled both daughters in activities designed to build character and skills, from piano lessons and soccer teams to academic enrichment programs and leadership development camps. She maintained detailed records of their achievements and struggles, approaching their education with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized all of her domestic responsibilities. The investment in their development was substantial, both financially and emotionally. Caroline's response to this intensive parenting approach differed significantly from Victoria's, though both daughters appeared to thrive under Margaret's guidance. Caroline embraced the traditional feminine roles that Margaret modeled, showing early aptitude for domestic skills and expressing interest in marriage and motherhood as primary life goals. She was an affectionate and compliant child who seemed genuinely eager to please Margaret and to earn approval through conformity to family expectations and values. Victoria's personality development followed a different trajectory that initially pleased Margaret but would eventually create tension and conflict within the family system. Victoria demonstrated leadership qualities and intellectual independence that Margaret recognized as valuable assets. But she also showed less interest in domestic activities and greater attraction to challenges that required individual rather than collaborative achievement. Margaret initially interpreted these traits as evidence of Victoria's superior potential and worked to channel her daughter's ambitions in directions that would bring credit to the family. The family's financial situation had been comfortable but not extraordinary during Robert's lifetime, sustained by his insurance industry salary and Margaret's careful management of household expenses. Robert carried substantial life insurance coverage as a standard practice within his profession, but the family's lifestyle was based on his continued earning capacity rather than accumulated wealth. Margaret understood that maintaining their standard of living would require careful planning and potentially significant lifestyle adjustments if Robert's income were suddenly eliminated. The relationship between the two sisters had been characterized by affection and mutual support throughout their childhood and adolescence, though their different personalities and interests created natural differences in their approaches to family relationships and individual development. Victoria served as something of a protective older sister, helping Caroline navigate academic challenges and social situations that might otherwise have caused difficulty. Caroline admired Victoria's confidence and achievements while remaining secure in her own chosen path toward more traditional feminine fulfillment. Margaret's parenting philosophy emphasized the importance of family loyalty and mutual support as fundamental values that should guide all major life decisions. She taught both daughters that their individual success and happiness were connected to the welfare of the family as a whole, and that personal choices should be evaluated based on their impact on family harmony and collective well-being. This emphasis on interdependence created strong emotional bonds between family members, but it also established expectations about mutual obligation that would later be exploited for manipulative purposes. The first signs of the psychological patterns that would eventually lead to attempted murder appeared during Victoria's college years, though they were so subtle and seemingly reasonable that no one recognized them as warning signals. Margaret began expressing concerns about Victoria's increasing independence and her focus on career development at the expense of romantic relationships and family connections. These concerns were framed as maternal wisdom and loving guidance, but they reflected deeper anxieties about Victoria's potential to outgrow the family system that Margaret had worked so hard to create and maintain. Robert's sudden death from a heart attack in 2020 transformed the family dynamics in ways that initially appeared to strengthen their bonds but actually created opportunities for manipulation and exploitation that had not previously existed. Victoria was 25 years old, recently graduated from college, and in the early stages of building her marketing consultancy. Caroline was 23, newly married to David Chen, and focused on establishing her own household and preparing for eventual motherhood. Margaret's response to widowhood revealed both admirable strength and concerning psychological patterns that would intensify over the following years. She handled the immediate practical challenges of Robert's death with impressive competence, managing funeral arrangements, insurance claims, and estate settlement procedures with minimal assistance from her daughters. Her grief appeared genuine and proportionate, and she maintained her role as family matriarch while adjusting to the reality of life without the husband who had provided both financial support and emotional partnership for over 30 years. The financial implications of Robert's death were significant, but not catastrophic for the family's immediate welfare. His life insurance provided Margaret with resources sufficient to maintain the house and her basic lifestyle, though at a reduced level that eliminated many of the luxuries that had characterized their previous standard of living. Victoria and Caroline both understood that they would need to assume greater financial responsibility for family welfare, and both daughters willingly accepted these obligations as appropriate expressions of family loyalty and gratitude for their parents' investment in their development. Victoria's business success during the 3 years following Robert's death exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. The marketing consultancy grew rapidly, as small and medium-sized businesses throughout the Southwest recognized the value of her strategic approach to digital advertising and brand development. Her income increased substantially each year, providing financial security that allowed her to support Margaret's household expenses while building her own wealth and establishing professional credibility within the competitive marketing industry. The pattern of financial dependence that developed during this period appeared natural and beneficial to all parties involved. Victoria took pride in her ability to honor Robert's memory by continuing his tradition of family generosity and support. Margaret expressed appropriate gratitude for Victoria's assistance, while maintaining her dignity and independence as much as possible, given her reduced circumstances. Caroline and David benefited from Victoria's help with major purchases and expenses, while contributing their own efforts to family maintenance and emotional support. Margaret's psychological state during the years following Robert's death underwent changes that were initially imperceptible, but gradually became more pronounced and concerning. The loss of her primary adult relationship and the reduction in her financial security created anxieties that she managed through increased focus on controlling family dynamics and ensuring her continued centrality to her daughters' lives. She began to view Victoria's success with ambivalence, appreciating the financial benefits while resenting the independence and authority that accompanied Victoria's role as family provider. The suggestion that Victoria should increase her life insurance coverage emerged from what appeared to be reasonable concern for family financial security in the event of Victoria's unexpected death. Margaret pointed out that the family had become economically dependent on Victoria's continued earning capacity, and that responsible planning required protection against the possibility that accident or illness might eliminate their primary source of income. The logic was compelling, and Victoria's agreement to purchase additional coverage seemed like a natural expression of her commitment to family welfare. Caroline's role in the developing conspiracy was initially that of a supportive ally who echoed Margaret's concerns and reinforced the arguments in favor of increased insurance coverage. Her participation appeared to reflect genuine worry about family financial security rather than calculated manipulation, and Victoria had no reason to suspect that her younger sister harbored any resentment about their different life paths or any willingness to participate in plans that would result in Victoria's death. The car accident that occurred in January served as a convenient pretext for escalating discussions about Victoria's vulnerability and the family's need for protection against the loss of her income. Margaret and Caroline used the incident to justify their increased attention to estate planning and insurance matters, framing their concerns as natural responses to a frightening reminder of life's unpredictability. Victoria's agreement to purchase the $2 million policy represented the final piece of their plan, though she had no understanding of the role her decision would play in their scheme. The 3 months between the insurance policy's effective date and the incident at Margaret's house were characterized by subtle but significant changes in family dynamics that Victoria noticed but did not interpret correctly. Margaret's invitations to family gatherings became more frequent and urgent, as if she were creating opportunities to spend time with Victoria, while such opportunities remained available. Caroline's attention to Victoria's schedule and travel plans became more detailed and intrusive, though her questions seemed to reflect sisterly concern rather than surveillance. The furniture-moving request that brought Victoria to Margaret's house on the day of the incident was carefully calculated to create an opportunity for what would appear to be an accidental fall down the spiral staircase. Margaret had prepared for weeks, studying the layout of the house and the positioning of furniture that would make Victoria's presence on the staircase seem natural and inevitable. The cancellation of Caroline and David's dinner plans ensured that no witnesses would be present to observe or prevent the accident that Margaret had planned so carefully. The psychological preparation required for Margaret to push her own daughter down a flight of stairs reveals the extent to which grief, financial anxiety, and resentment had corrupted her fundamental values and emotional attachments. The woman who had devoted decades to nurturing and protecting her children had become capable of attempted murder when she perceived Victoria's success as a threat to her own security and authority. The transformation was gradual and hidden beneath surface behaviors that continued to appear loving and appropriate. Caroline's willingness to participate in the conspiracy, even in a supporting role, demonstrated that the family's emphasis on loyalty and mutual obligation had been twisted into justification for betrayal and violence. Her psychological investment in maintaining Margaret's approval and her own financial security overcame whatever natural affection and protective instincts she might have felt toward her older sister. The relationship that had begun with genuine sisterly love had been corrupted by greed and manipulation. The conversation that Victoria overheard in the hospital corridor revealed the true nature of the relationships that had shaped her entire adult life. The people she had trusted most completely, supported most generously, and loved most deeply had viewed her primarily as a resource to be exploited and ultimately eliminated when she became inconvenient to their plans. The betrayal was absolute and devastating, but it would also prove to be the catalyst for a transformation that would reveal strengths and capabilities that Victoria herself had never recognized or developed. The days following Victoria's devastating discovery in the hospital corridor passed in a haze of physical pain and psychological torment that challenged every assumption she had ever made about human nature, family loyalty, and her own judgment. The woman who had prided herself on reading people accurately, building successful business relationships through intuitive understanding of motivation and character, now confronted the reality that she had been catastrophically wrong about the two people she knew best in the world. The medical environment that surrounded Victoria during those crucial early days of recovery created a strange juxtaposition between the clinical efficiency of professional healthcare and the intimate betrayal that had brought her to this sterile sanctuary. Nurses moved through their routines with competent compassion, monitoring vital signs and administering medications while maintaining cheerful conversation designed to encourage healing. Doctors conducted examinations with systematic thoroughness, explaining procedures and prognoses with measured optimism that reflected their commitment to patient welfare. The contrast between their genuine care and her family's calculated malice created a cognitive dissonance that made Victoria question her ability to distinguish between authentic and manipulative behavior. Margaret and Caroline maintained their vigil beside Victoria's bed with performances of grief and concern that would have convinced any objective observer of their devotion and anguish. Margaret brought fresh flowers daily, arranged them carefully in the bedside vase, and spent hours reading aloud from books she claimed were Victoria's favorites. Caroline arrived each morning with updates about work calls she had fielded on Victoria's behalf, client concerns she was managing, and business decisions that required Victoria's input when she felt strong enough to provide guidance. Their Oscar-worthy displays of sisterly and maternal love created a bizarre theater of deception that Victoria was forced to witness while maintaining her own performance of grateful appreciation. She understood instinctively that revealing her knowledge of their conspiracy would place her in immediate danger, since they had already demonstrated their willingness to kill her, and would not hesitate to complete the task if they suspected their plan had been exposed. Her survival depended on convincing them that she remained the trusting, naive victim they believed they had created. The psychological challenge of maintaining this deception while processing the magnitude of their betrayal required emotional reserves that Victoria had never previously needed to access. Every expression of gratitude for their care, every smile in response to their false comfort, every word of appreciation for their sacrifice, felt like a betrayal of her own integrity and intelligence. She was forced to become complicit in their charade while secretly planning her own survival and eventual revenge. The physical limitations imposed by her injuries added another layer of vulnerability to her already precarious situation. The head trauma had left her with severe headaches, dizziness, and moments of confusion that made it difficult to think clearly or plan effectively. Her broken ribs created constant pain that worsened with any movement, making it impossible to shift position in bed without assistance. The internal bleeding that had required emergency surgery continued to cause weakness and fatigue that left her exhausted after even brief periods of consciousness. These physical constraints meant that Victoria was entirely dependent on Margaret and Caroline for basic needs, including food, medication, personal hygiene, and communication with the outside world. They controlled access to her phone, filtered her mail and messages, and served as intermediaries for all contact with her business associates and friends. The isolation they created was systematic and complete, ensuring that no one else could observe Victoria's condition or provide alternative perspectives on her family's behavior. The medical staff, despite their professional competence and genuine concern for Victoria's welfare, were unknowingly complicit in maintaining the conditions that made her vulnerable to further harm. Their protocols required them to work primarily through family members for all non-medical decisions affecting Victoria's care, treatment, and discharge planning. Margaret's presentation as a devoted mother naturally positioned her as the primary advocate and decision-maker regarding Victoria's recovery process. Dr. Patricia Williams, the neurologist overseeing Victoria's treatment, was particularly impressed by Margaret's apparent dedication and informed involvement in her daughter's care. Margaret asked detailed questions about treatment options, insisted on thorough explanations of all procedures, and maintained careful records of Victoria's progress that demonstrated what appeared to be exemplary maternal concern. Her behavior convinced Dr. Williams that Victoria was fortunate to have such committed family support during her vulnerable recovery period. Caroline's role in these medical interactions was that of the devoted sister who balanced emotional support with practical assistance in managing the complex logistics of Victoria's care. She coordinated with Victoria's business associates to handle urgent client needs, arranged for flowers and gifts from concerned friends, and maintained detailed schedules of visiting hours and medical appointments. Her efficiency and apparent selflessness impressed healthcare providers who recognized the burden that such responsibilities placed on family members. The irony of receiving such dedicated care from the very people who had orchestrated her injuries was not lost on Victoria, though she lacked the energy or opportunity to fully appreciate the psychological complexity of her situation. Margaret and Caroline were genuinely concerned about her recovery, but only because her survival was necessary for their plan to succeed completely. They needed her to heal sufficiently to be discharged from the hospital, return to work, and resume the lifestyle that would make her eventual death appear natural and unrelated to their previous attempt. The insurance policy that had motivated their conspiracy required that Victoria survive long enough for the waiting period to expire, and for any suspicion about the circumstances of her accident to fade from official attention. A death during hospitalization would have triggered investigations that might have revealed the planned nature of her fall. Their optimal scenario required her to recover, return to normal activities, and then succumb to what would appear to be complications from her injuries, or perhaps another unfortunate accident that could not be connected to their involvement. Victoria's gradual understanding of these tactical considerations added another dimension to her psychological torment. She realized that her recovery was not a victory over their malice, but rather a continuation of their manipulation. Every milestone of healing, every reduction in pain, every improvement in her mobility brought her closer to the moment when they would feel safe to complete their murderous plan. The medical progress that should have represented hope and renewal instead marked time toward her eventual execution. The conversations she overheard during their visits revealed additional details about their conspiracy that deepened her understanding of how thoroughly they had planned her destruction. Margaret and Caroline discussed logistics with the casual efficiency of business partners reviewing a profitable venture. They debated optimal timing for her discharge, strategies for ensuring she would be alone during vulnerable moments, and methods for creating circumstances that would allow for a second, more successful attempt on her life. Their discussions also revealed the extent to which they had prepared for the financial windfall that her death would provide. Margaret had already consulted with financial advisors about investment strategies for managing a $2 million inheritance, while Caroline had researched real estate options that would allow her family to upgrade their living situation substantially. They spoke about Victoria's death not as a tragic loss but as a business opportunity that would solve their respective financial challenges and provide security for their futures. The callousness of these conversations was devastating to Victoria, but they also provided crucial intelligence that would inform her own survival planning. She learned about their timeline expectations, their assessment of potential risks to their plan, and their assumptions about her continued vulnerability and naivete. Each detail they shared was a weapon she could potentially use against them, though her current circumstances made it impossible to take immediate action on her growing knowledge. The isolation imposed by her dependence on Margaret and Caroline also meant that Victoria had no opportunity to confide in anyone about her discovery, or to seek help from people who might have provided protection or assistance. Her business associates were told that she was recovering well, but needed complete rest and freedom from work-related stress. Her few close friends received similar messages discouraging visits or phone calls during her initial recovery period. The systematic exclusion of potential allies was presented as necessary medical precaution, but served to ensure that no one else would have opportunity to observe the family dynamics or question the narrative of accidental injury. Dr. Williams' optimistic reports about Victoria's neurological recovery created additional pressure by establishing expectations for her return to normal cognitive function. The doctor explained that while Victoria's memory of the accident itself might never return due to the nature of head trauma, her overall mental capacity should be fully restored as the brain swelling subsided and her general health improved. This prognosis was encouraging from a medical standpoint but terrifying from Victoria's perspective, since it meant that Margaret and Caroline would eventually expect her to resume her previous lifestyle and vulnerability to their manipulation. The physical therapy sessions that began during Victoria's second week in the hospital provided her first opportunities to interact with healthcare providers without Margaret or Caroline's direct supervision. The therapists were focused on assessing and improving her motor functions, balance, and coordination, but they also provided Victoria with brief respites from the psychological pressure of maintaining her deception in front of her would-be murderers. Sarah Martinez, the physical therapist assigned to Victoria's case, was a woman in her 40s whose professional experience had taught her to recognize signs of domestic abuse and family dysfunction that might complicate patient recovery. She noticed subtle aspects of Victoria's behavior that suggested anxiety and fear rather than simple physical discomfort, though she initially attributed these observations to normal psychological responses to trauma and hospitalization. During their sessions, Victoria found herself drawn to Sarah's straightforward competence and genuine concern for her welfare. The therapist's approach to rehabilitation was encouraging but realistic, focused on achievable goals that would rebuild Victoria's confidence, along with her physical capabilities. Sarah's professional optimism provided a stark contrast to the false hope and manipulative comfort that Margaret and Caroline offered during their visits. The small improvements in Victoria's physical condition during these therapy sessions became sources of secret satisfaction that she was careful to hide from her family. Each successful movement, each reduction in pain, each sign of returning strength was evidence that she was becoming less vulnerable to their future plans. While Margaret and Caroline celebrated her progress as necessary preparation for her eventual execution, Victoria understood it as preparation for her survival and escape. The hospital's social worker, Linda Chen, conducted routine interviews with Victoria about her discharge planning and home care needs. These conversations were supposed to ensure that patients had adequate support systems and safe environments for continued recovery. But they became additional opportunities for Margaret and Caroline to demonstrate their apparent devotion while gathering information about official expectations for Victoria's care. Linda was impressed by the family's commitment to providing comprehensive support for Victoria's transition back to independent living. Margaret had already researched home care services, medical equipment rental, and modifications to Victoria's living space that would accommodate her temporary limitations. Caroline had arranged to take extended leave from her part-time work to provide daily assistance during the initial weeks of Victoria's recovery. Their preparation appeared thorough and appropriate, convincing Linda that Victoria would have excellent care during her vulnerable rehabilitation period. The discharge planning process also required detailed discussions about Victoria's return to work and resumption of normal activities. Margaret and Caroline were careful to express appropriate concern about pushing Victoria too quickly, while also demonstrating their understanding that her business responsibilities would eventually require her full attention and engagement. They struck exactly the right balance between protective caution and practical recognition of her professional obligations. These conversations reinforced Victoria's understanding that her family's plan extended well beyond her initial injury and hospitalization. They were positioning themselves to maintain control over her living situation, her schedule, and her access to outside support during the crucial months when she would be rebuilding her strength and independence. The comprehensive nature of their preparation revealed the sophistication of their conspiracy and the extent to which they had considered every aspect of her destruction. As Victoria's second week in the hospital drew to a close, she began to understand that her survival would depend not on medical care or family support, but on her own ability to outmaneuver people who had already demonstrated their willingness and capability to kill her. The realization was terrifying, but also liberating, since it freed her from any obligation to trust or depend on people who had forfeited all claim to her loyalty and affection. The woman who would eventually leave that hospital would be fundamentally different from the trusting daughter and sister who had walked into Margaret's house to help move furniture. The transformation was beginning in that bed, through hours of forced stillness that allowed her to process the magnitude of her situation and begin planning her response to the ultimate betrayal. Victoria was learning that survival sometimes requires becoming harder, smarter, and more ruthless than the people who seek to destroy you. Victoria's transition from the hospital to her mother's house for recovery represented the most dangerous phase of her ordeal, requiring her to maintain an increasingly sophisticated deception while navigating circumstances designed to make her vulnerable to a second, more successful murder attempt. The discharge planning process had positioned Margaret as the ideal caregiver, and Victoria's apparent gratitude for this arrangement convinced medical professionals that she would receive exemplary care during her rehabilitation period. The move itself occurred on a Thursday morning in April, orchestrated with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized Margaret's planning of the original attack. An ambulance transported Victoria from the hospital to the Biltmore house, where Margaret had spent the previous week preparing what she presented as a comprehensive recovery environment. The living room had been converted into a makeshift medical suite, complete with a hospital bed, wheelchair accessibility modifications, and monitoring equipment that would allow Margaret to track Victoria's vital signs and medication schedule. Margaret's preparation extended far beyond the visible medical accommodations. She had researched extensively about head trauma recovery, studying symptoms and behavioral patterns that would allow her to distinguish between genuine medical issues and potential signs that Victoria might be regaining memories of the attack. Her knowledge of traumatic brain injury protocols enabled her to present herself as an informed and dedicated caregiver, while actually gathering intelligence that would inform her assessment of when Victoria might become dangerous to their conspiracy. The house itself had been modified in ways that appeared supportive but actually increased Victoria's isolation and vulnerability. Margaret had installed new locks on exterior doors, ostensibly for security purposes but actually to control Victoria's access to outside contact and potential escape routes. The telephone system had been upgraded to include monitoring capabilities that would allow Margaret to screen all incoming and outgoing calls. Internet access had been restricted through parental controls that Margaret claimed were necessary to prevent Victoria from becoming overwhelmed by work-related communications during her recovery. Caroline's role in this domestic imprisonment was that of the devoted sister who divided her time between caring for her own family and providing supplemental support for Victoria's rehabilitation. She arrived each morning with fresh groceries, prepared meals that met Victoria's supposed dietary restrictions, and maintained detailed logs of medication administration and physical therapy progress. Her presence provided Margaret with additional security while also creating the appearance of comprehensive family support that would satisfy any external oversight. Dr. Williams had established a schedule of weekly home visits during Victoria's first month of recovery, providing medical monitoring that was intended to ensure appropriate healing and identify potential complications. These appointments became elaborate performances during which Margaret and Caroline demonstrated their competence as caregivers, while Victoria was forced to maintain her facade of grateful dependence and gradual improvement. The neurologist's examinations focused primarily on cognitive function, motor skills, and neurological responses that would indicate normal recovery from traumatic brain injury. Victoria understood that these assessments were crucial to her survival, since any indication of complete mental recovery would signal to Margaret and Caroline that she posed a potential threat to their conspiracy. She learned to modulate her responses carefully, demonstrating sufficient improvement to avoid suspicion of malingering, while avoiding the level of cognitive clarity that would suggest full memory recovery. Victoria's performance during these medical evaluations required extraordinary psychological discipline and strategic thinking. The balance was delicate and dangerous, since any miscalculation could result in either premature discharge that would eliminate medical oversight or suspicious behavior that might prompt Margaret and Caroline to accelerate their timeline for eliminating her. The daily routine that developed during Victoria's supposed recovery period created numerous opportunities for Margaret and Caroline to assess her mental state and plan their next move. Morning medication administration allowed them to monitor her alertness and responsiveness. Physical therapy sessions provided insight into her motor function recovery and overall strength. Evening conversations tested her memory and cognitive processing while maintaining the appearance of normal family interaction. Victoria's business associates remained concerned about her extended absence and recovery timeline, but Margaret and Caroline managed these external pressures with strategic communication that balanced professional responsibility with medical necessity. They assured clients that Victoria was receiving excellent care and making steady progress, while emphasizing that premature return to work could jeopardize her long-term recovery. The explanation was medically plausible and emotionally compelling, effectively discouraging anyone from demanding direct contact with Victoria or questioning the family's management of her affairs. Jennifer Morrison, Victoria's assistant, was particularly persistent in requesting opportunities to visit or speak directly with Victoria about urgent business matters. Margaret handled these requests with apparent reluctance and protective concern, explaining that Victoria's doctors had recommended minimal stress and limited professional engagement during the critical early stages of her neurological recovery. She promised to relay important messages and assured Jennifer that Victoria would resume direct communication as soon as her medical team deemed it appropriate. The financial implications of Victoria's extended incapacity created additional pressure that Margaret and Caroline used to justify their control over her business and personal affairs. They obtained power of attorney documentation that gave them legal authority to manage Victoria's finances, make business decisions, and handle insurance claims related to her medical expenses. The paperwork was presented as necessary protection for Victoria's interests during her period of diminished capacity, though it actually provided them with comprehensive access to her assets and income. Victoria's gradual understanding of how thoroughly they had isolated her and assumed control over every aspect of her life was both terrifying and educating. She began to appreciate the sophistication of their conspiracy and the extent to which they had prepared for every contingency. The realization that they had planned not just her murder but also the systematic appropriation of her life's work and accumulated wealth revealed the depth of their betrayal and the comprehensive nature of their greed. The insurance investigation that followed Victoria's accident was handled with professional thoroughness that initially concerned Margaret and Caroline, but ultimately vindicated their careful preparation. The adjusters interviewed Victoria about her recollection of events, examined the physical evidence at the accident scene, and reviewed medical records to assess the legitimacy of the claim. Victoria's apparent memory loss regarding the specific circumstances of her fall was consistent with documented patterns of traumatic brain injury, and the physical evidence supported the narrative of accidental injury during routine household activity. Margaret's performance during these insurance interviews was masterful, combining appropriate grief and concern with detailed factual information that supported the accidental nature of Victoria's fall. She provided a timeline of events that was internally consistent and medically plausible, supported by Caroline's corroborating testimony about family plans and Victoria's normal behavior patterns. The adjusters found no evidence of suspicious circumstances or motivation for intentional harm, concluding that the claim represented a legitimate accidental injury covered by Victoria's homeowner's insurance policy. The successful resolution of the insurance investigation provided Margaret and Caroline with confidence that their conspiracy had been executed flawlessly, and that no external scrutiny would threaten their future plans. They began discussing more openly their expectations for Victoria's eventual death, and their strategies for managing the life insurance claim that would provide their ultimate financial reward. These conversations, conducted in Victoria's presence with the assumption that her cognitive impairment prevented her from understanding their implications, provided her with crucial intelligence about their timeline and methodology. Victoria learned that Margaret and Caroline were planning to wait approximately 6 months before implementing their next attempt on her life, allowing sufficient time for the accident investigation to be forgotten, and for Victoria's apparent recovery to make a sudden decline seem naturally tragic rather than suspiciously convenient. They discussed various scenarios for creating circumstances that would result in her death, while maintaining the appearance of medical complications or secondary accidents related to her original injuries. The psychological torture of listening to these planning sessions while maintaining her facade of impaired comprehension tested Victoria's emotional endurance to its limits. She was forced to appear confused and vulnerable, while actually developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for survival and eventual justice. The contrast between her apparent helplessness and her growing internal strength became a source of motivation that sustained her through the darkest periods of her captivity. Dr. Williams' weekly visits provided Victoria with brief respites from the constant surveillance and manipulation, though even these medical appointments were carefully monitored by Margaret and Caroline. The neurologist remained optimistic about Victoria's prognosis, noting steady improvement in her cognitive function and motor skills, while acknowledging that complete recovery from such severe trauma would require many months of patient rehabilitation. Her assessment supported Margaret and Caroline's narrative, while providing Victoria with legitimate medical validation of her improving condition. The physical therapy regimen that Dr. Williams prescribed included exercises designed to rebuild Victoria's strength, coordination, and balance. Margaret and Caroline supervised these sessions carefully, ostensibly to ensure proper technique and prevent re-injury, but actually to monitor Victoria's developing physical capabilities and assess her potential for independent movement or escape attempts. Victoria learned to perform at levels that appeared consistent with her supposed limitations while secretly developing strength and mobility that exceeded their expectations. The home care nurse who visited twice weekly provided additional medical oversight and professional assessment of Victoria's recovery progress. Nancy Rodriguez was an experienced healthcare provider whose observations could have revealed inconsistencies in Victoria's presentation or suspicious aspects of her care environment. However, Margaret's preparation and performance were so thorough that Nancy consistently reported appropriate care standards and normal recovery patterns that supported the family's narrative of devoted support and medical compliance. Victoria's interactions with Nancy represented some of her most dangerous moments, since any indication of her true mental state or awareness of her situation could have prompted investigations that would threaten Margaret and Caroline's plans. She learned to communicate with Nancy in ways that appeared consistent with cognitive impairment while avoiding responses that might suggest malingering or deception. The balance required constant vigilance and strategic thinking that exhausted her mentally and emotionally. The isolation from her normal social and professional relationships continued to be maintained through Margaret and Caroline's careful management of external communications. Victoria's friends received regular updates about her recovery progress that discouraged visits while maintaining the appearance of gradual improvement. Business associates were assured that she was receiving excellent care and making steady progress toward eventual return to work. The consistent messaging prevented anyone from developing suspicions about her extended absence or questioning the family's exclusive control over her care. As Victoria's supposed recovery entered its second month, she began to understand that her survival would require not just maintaining her deception, but actively planning her escape and the exposure of Margaret and Caroline's conspiracy. The realization that no external intervention would rescue her from her situation was simultaneously terrifying and liberating, since it freed her from dependence on others and focused her attention on developing her own resources and capabilities. The woman who had entered Margaret's house as a trusting daughter was evolving into someone far more dangerous to her enemies than they could imagine. Victoria was learning that survival in desperate circumstances requires not just physical resilience, but psychological sophistication that can outmaneuver opponents who believe they hold all the advantages. Her apparent vulnerability was becoming a strategic asset that would eventually enable her to turn their own assumptions and overconfidence against them. The foundation for Victoria's ultimate victory was being laid during these weeks of careful performance and patient observation. Every detail she learned about their plans, every moment of underestimation they displayed, every assumption they made about her limitations was becoming ammunition for the counterattack that would eventually destroy their conspiracy and reclaim her life from those who had tried to steal it from her. The catastrophic moment that would shatter Victoria's carefully maintained facade occurred on a humid Tuesday evening in late May, when Margaret's impatience finally overcame her strategic caution and precipitated the confrontation that would force Victoria to choose between continued deception and immediate survival. The incident began innocuously enough, with Margaret preparing Victoria's evening medications in the makeshift medical station she had established in the converted living room. Victoria had been residing in Margaret's house for 7 weeks, maintaining her performance of cognitive impairment while secretly documenting every detail of her captor's conspiracy through careful observation and patient intelligence gathering. Her apparent progress had been calibrated to suggest gradual neurological recovery without indicating the complete mental clarity that would make her dangerous to Margaret and Caroline's plans. The balance had become increasingly difficult to maintain as her actual cognitive function returned to full capacity, while her circumstances remained those of a helpless invalid dependent on the mercy of her would-be murderers. Margaret's behavior during recent days had displayed subtle signs of growing tension and impatience that Victoria recognized as potentially dangerous developments in their psychological chess match. The insurance investigation had concluded favorably. Dr. Williams had expressed satisfaction with Victoria's recovery trajectory, and external observers had accepted the narrative of devoted family care during a tragic medical crisis. These successes should have provided Margaret with confidence and satisfaction, but instead seemed to increase her anxiety about maintaining the deception for the extended period their plan required. The evening medication routine had become one of the most precarious moments in Victoria's daily performance, requiring her to accept pharmaceutical substances that Margaret selected and administered without medical supervision or documentation. Victoria had gradually developed techniques for avoiding full consumption of these medications, understanding that complete compliance would leave her genuinely incapacitated and vulnerable to whatever final assault Margaret and Caroline were planning. The risk of discovery during these sessions had increased as Margaret became more attentive to Victoria's responses and recovery indicators. On this particular evening, Margaret approached the medication preparation with an unusual intensity that immediately heightened Victoria's awareness of potential danger. Instead of the routine combination of prescribed painkillers and anti-inflammatory drugs that had characterized previous sessions, Margaret had assembled a collection of pharmaceutical bottles that Victoria did not recognize, and that appeared to represent a significant escalation in both dosage and variety of substances being administered. The conversation that preceded this medication session revealed Margaret's growing frustration with the timeline constraints imposed by their need to maintain the appearance of natural medical progression. She expressed irritation about the extended recovery period, complained about the financial burden of maintaining Victoria's care, and made increasingly direct comments about her eagerness to resolve the situation and return to normal family life. Her words carried implications that Victoria understood as thinly veiled threats about expediting the conclusion of her supposed medical treatment. Victoria's response to these verbal provocations required extraordinary self-control and strategic thinking, since any indication of comprehension or concern would expose her awareness of the true nature of her situation. She maintained her facade of confused vulnerability while internally preparing for whatever escalation Margaret's behavior suggested was imminent. The medication administration that followed would prove to be the catalyst for events that would transform her from passive victim to active survivor. Margaret's preparation of the evening medications differed significantly from previous sessions in ways that immediately alarmed Victoria and confirmed her suspicions about the evening's dangerous potential. The quantities were substantially larger than usual. The combination included substances that Victoria had never seen before, and Margaret's demeanor suggested nervous excitement rather than routine clinical administration. When Margaret announced that Dr. Williams had prescribed new medications to accelerate Victoria's neurological recovery, Victoria understood that this represented either a genuine attempt to incapacitate her completely or a test of her continued compliance and vulnerability. The decision Victoria faced in that moment would determine whether she continued her passive deception in hopes of eventually finding a safer opportunity for escape, or revealed her true capabilities in a desperate gamble for immediate survival. The internal calculation required her to assess Margaret's current mental state, evaluate the likelihood that the proposed medications would cause permanent harm or death, and determine whether her current physical condition would allow her to successfully resist or escape if she abandoned her performance of helplessness. Victoria's choice to refuse the medications marked the end of her period of strategic passivity and the beginning of open conflict that would test both her physical capabilities and her psychological resilience against opponents who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder. Her calm but firm statement that she would not take the medications without direct consultation with Dr. Williams represented a declaration of independence that Margaret immediately recognized as evidence that Victoria's cognitive recovery had progressed far beyond what she had been pretending. Margaret's reaction to this defiance was swift and revealing, combining genuine surprise at Victoria's mental clarity with rage at the realization that her careful manipulation had been unsuccessful in maintaining control over her intended victim. The mask of maternal concern that had characterized her behavior for weeks disappeared immediately, replaced by cold calculation and threatening language that left no doubt about her intentions or her assessment of Victoria's continued usefulness to their conspiracy. The confrontation that followed was brutal in its honesty, and devastating in its implications for any remaining possibility of family reconciliation or peaceful resolution. Margaret abandoned all pretense of caring about Victoria's welfare, explicitly stating her frustration with the extended timeline their plan had required, and her eagerness to conclude the business of Victoria's elimination. She detailed the financial pressures that had motivated their conspiracy, expressed resentment about Victoria's professional success and independence, and made clear that the insurance money represented not just opportunity but necessary relief from economic circumstances that had become increasingly desperate. Victoria's response to these revelations demonstrated the psychological transformation that had occurred during her weeks of forced captivity and careful observation. Rather than expressing shock or hurt at Margaret's admissions, She replied with strategic questions designed to gather additional intelligence about their conspiracy, while assessing her current tactical situation. Her calm demeanor and analytical approach to the confrontation clearly surprised Margaret, who had expected either continued compliance or helpless desperation, rather than the controlled competence that Victoria displayed. The strategic information that Victoria extracted during this confrontation provided crucial details about the timeline and methodology of Margaret and Caroline's plans. She learned that they had been preparing for several weeks to implement what they called the final phase of their operation, involving medications that would simulate natural complications from her original injuries while actually causing organ failure that would result in death within hours. The plan was sophisticated and medically plausible, designed to avoid suspicion while ensuring that no opportunity would exist for medical intervention or survival. Caroline's arrival during the height of this confrontation added another dimension to the psychological warfare, while also providing Victoria with additional intelligence about the conspiracy's scope and coordination. Caroline's immediate recognition that Victoria had regained full cognitive function and her calm acceptance of the need to proceed with immediate implementation of their murder plan revealed the extent to which both women had prepared psychologically for the violence their conspiracy required. The tactical disadvantage that Victoria faced in this confrontation was significant but not insurmountable. She remained physically weakened from her injuries and months of controlled inactivity. She was outnumbered by opponents who had planned extensively for this scenario, and she was isolated in a location that Margaret and Caroline controlled completely. However, her weeks of careful observation had provided her with detailed knowledge of the house layout, the locations of potential weapons or escape routes, and the psychological profiles of her opponents that would inform her survival strategy. Victoria's assessment of Margaret and Caroline's capabilities revealed important vulnerabilities that could be exploited, despite her tactical disadvantages. Neither woman had experience with direct physical violence beyond the initial assault that had brought Victoria to this situation. Their planning had focused primarily on deception and manipulation rather than combat or restraint of a conscious and resisting victim. Most significantly, their emotional investment in the success of their conspiracy had created psychological pressure that was affecting their judgment and tactical decision-making. The physical altercation that began when Victoria refused to submit passively to their final assault demonstrated capabilities that surprised both her opponents and herself. Months of carefully hidden physical therapy and strength building had restored more of her motor function and coordination than Margaret and Caroline had realized. More importantly, the psychological preparation that had sustained her through weeks of performance and planning had eliminated the hesitation and moral constraints that might otherwise have limited her willingness to defend herself with necessary violence. Margaret's attempt to force medication administration through physical restraint proved to be a critical tactical error that provided Victoria with the opportunity she needed to transition from defensive to offensive action. The struggle that ensued was brief but decisive, resulting in Margaret's incapacitation and Caroline's retreat to summon additional assistance. Victoria's successful resistance to their assault provided her with the psychological victory of proving that their assumptions about her continued helplessness had been fundamentally incorrect. The aftermath of this confrontation left Victoria with limited time to escape before Caroline returned with reinforcements or external assistance that would overwhelm her tactical advantages. Her knowledge of the house layout and the locations of Margaret's car keys enabled her to plan an escape route that would provide her with transportation and the opportunity to reach safety before her opponents could organize pursuit or implement contingency plans for managing the exposure of their conspiracy. Victoria's successful escape from Margaret's house represented more than physical liberation from immediate danger. The experience of defending herself successfully against the people who had tried to destroy her provided psychological validation of her strength and capabilities that would sustain her through the challenges that lay ahead. She had proven to herself that survival was possible even in circumstances that appeared hopeless, and that careful preparation and strategic thinking could overcome apparently insurmountable disadvantages. The woman who drove away from Margaret's house that evening was fundamentally different from the trusting daughter who had arrived to help move furniture 3 months earlier. Victoria had been transformed by betrayal and suffering into someone capable of the strategic thinking and decisive action that survival in hostile circumstances requires. Her apparent victimization had concealed the development of resources and capabilities that would enable her not just to escape her immediate danger but to seek justice for the crimes committed against her. The breaking point that had seemed to represent the ultimate crisis of Victoria's ordeal actually marked the beginning of her transition from victim to survivor, to eventual victor over those who had underestimated her resilience and resourcefulness. The foundation for her ultimate triumph had been laid through months of careful observation, patient planning, and the kind of inner strength that emerges only when survival depends entirely on one's own resources and determination. Victoria's escape from Margaret's house launched her into a nightmarish period of survival that would test every resource she had developed during her months of captivity, while forcing her to navigate a world where the people she had trusted most were actively hunting her with murderous intent. The immediate aftermath of her confrontation with Margaret and Caroline left her in possession of Margaret's car keys, and approximately 20 minutes before Caroline would return with assistance that could overwhelm her tactical advantages and eliminate her opportunity for escape. The physical condition that Victoria brought to this desperate flight was far from optimal for the challenges she would face during the coming hours and days. Months of controlled inactivity and deliberate weakness had left her with reduced stamina and muscle tone, despite her secret efforts to maintain basic fitness through covert exercises. The original injuries from her fall down the staircase continued to create pain and limitation that would affect her mobility and endurance during extended periods of physical exertion. Most significantly, the psychological stress of maintaining her deception while planning for survival had exhausted her emotional reserves in ways that would impact her decision-making and resilience during the critical period ahead. Margaret's sedan provided Victoria with immediate transportation away from the scene of her confrontation, but it also represented significant tactical disadvantages that would complicate her escape strategy. The vehicle was easily identifiable by Margaret and Caroline, who could provide law enforcement with detailed descriptions that would facilitate tracking and apprehension efforts. The car contained registration and insurance documentation that clearly established Margaret's ownership, creating legal complications that could result in vehicle theft charges if Victoria was apprehended while driving it. Most problematically, Margaret and Caroline could report the vehicle as stolen, transforming Victoria from a victim seeking help into a criminal suspect fleeing from law enforcement. Victoria's destination options during this initial flight were severely limited by circumstances that reflected the thorough isolation Margaret and Caroline had imposed during her supposed recovery period. Her own home had been under their control for months, with Caroline possessing keys and security codes that would make it unsafe as a refuge or source of resources. Her business office presented similar risks, since Margaret and Caroline had maintained contact with her staff and could easily predict her potential destinations. Hotels and other commercial accommodations would require identification and credit card usage that could be tracked through financial systems that Margaret and Caroline could monitor through their power of attorney arrangements. The friends and professional associates who might normally have provided assistance during a crisis had been systematically alienated through months of managed communication that had portrayed Victoria as medically fragile and unavailable for direct contact. Jennifer Morrison and other business colleagues believed Victoria was still recovering from serious injuries under careful family supervision. Personal friends had received similar messages, discouraging visits, and establishing expectations that Victoria would resume normal social contact only when her medical team determined she was ready for such engagement. Victoria's financial resources were similarly compromised by the legal arrangements that Margaret and Caroline had implemented during her supposed incapacity. Her bank accounts remained accessible through debit cards in her possession, but any significant withdrawals or unusual transaction patterns would generate alerts that could be monitored by her supposed caregivers. Credit card usage would create electronic trails that could facilitate tracking efforts. The cash she carried was limited to the small amount Margaret had provided for incidental expenses during medical appointments, insufficient for extended independence or significant purchases that survival might require. The psychological challenge of navigating this flight was compounded by Victoria's need to simultaneously process the trauma of her family's betrayal while maintaining the clear thinking and strategic planning that her survival required. The emotional impact of understanding that her mother and sister had tried to murder her for insurance money was devastating enough under normal circumstances, but the need to remain focused and analytical while actively fleeing from their continued threats created internal tension that threatened to overwhelm her capacity for rational decision-making. Victoria's initial strategy focused on creating distance and time that would allow her to assess her situation more thoroughly and develop longer-term plans for survival and justice. She drove through Phoenix's suburban neighborhoods with careful attention to avoiding main thoroughfares and commercial areas where security cameras might record her location and movement patterns. Her knowledge of the city's layout provided advantages in selecting routes that would minimize visibility, while maximizing her options for changing direction or destination if circumstances required tactical adjustments. The decision to abandon Margaret's vehicle came after approximately 40 minutes of driving, when Victoria realized that continued use of the car represented unacceptable risks that outweighed its transportation benefits. She selected a large shopping mall parking lot where the sedan could remain unnoticed for several hours, while she considered alternative transportation options. The location provided access to public transit, commercial services, and communication facilities that could support her immediate needs, while offering multiple escape routes if her presence was discovered. Victoria's transformation from dependent invalid to fugitive survivor required rapid adaptation to circumstances far outside her previous experience or training. The business skills that had built her marketing consultancy provided some relevant capabilities in strategic thinking and problem-solving, but nothing in her background had prepared her for the practical challenges of avoiding detection while securing basic necessities for survival. The improvisation and resourcefulness that the situation demanded revealed personal strengths that she had never been required to develop or demonstrate. The shopping mall environment provided Victoria with temporary refuge, while also presenting significant challenges related to her appearance and behavior patterns that could attract unwanted attention. Her clothing was inappropriate for someone supposedly recovering from serious injuries who should be under medical supervision at home. Her visible anxiety and hypervigilant scanning of the environment suggested psychological distress that observant security personnel might interpret as indicating criminal activity or mental health crisis requiring intervention. Victoria's first priority became securing communication capabilities that would allow her to contact external assistance while avoiding electronic surveillance that Margaret and Caroline could potentially monitor. The prepaid cell phone she purchased with cash provided anonymous communication capacity, but it also required her to remember contact information for people who could provide help, since her regular phone contained all such data but remained in Margaret's possession and control. The process of identifying potential allies who could provide assistance without compromising her safety proved more difficult than Victoria had anticipated. Dr. Williams represented logical medical authority who could validate her claims about Margaret and Caroline's conspiracy, but contacting her would necessarily involve explaining circumstances that would be difficult to prove and potentially dangerous to discuss over unsecured communication channels. Law enforcement represented appropriate authority for criminal matters, but Victoria's status as someone who had been declared medically incompetent and her current possession of Margaret's vehicle created complications that could result in her detention rather than protection. Jennifer Morrison emerged as Victoria's most promising option for immediate assistance, despite the complications created by months of managed communication that had established expectations about Victoria's continued medical incapacity. Jennifer possessed detailed knowledge of Victoria's business affairs and personal circumstances that would enable her to understand the significance of the insurance conspiracy. Her professional relationship with Victoria provided motivation for offering assistance, while her lack of personal connection to Margaret and Caroline reduced the risks associated with potential information leakage or manipulation. The phone call to Jennifer represented Victoria's first direct communication with anyone outside Margaret and Caroline's control since her original hospitalization, making it both a crucial tactical necessity and a profound psychological milestone in her recovery of agency and independence. The conversation required careful explanation of circumstances that would seem incredible to someone who had been receiving regular updates about Victoria's supposedly peaceful recovery under devoted family care. Jennifer's initial response to Victoria's call reflected the confusion and concern that any reasonable person would experience when confronted with such dramatic contradictions to established expectations. Her immediate questions focused on Victoria's current medical status and location, reflecting genuine worry about her welfare combined with uncertainty about the reliability of her reported circumstances. The conversation required Victoria to provide sufficient evidence of her mental clarity and physical capability to convince Jennifer that assistance was appropriate while avoiding details that could compromise her safety if the information was somehow intercepted or misused. The practical arrangements that Jennifer agreed to provide included temporary shelter, clothing appropriate for Victoria's circumstances, access to legal and medical resources that could support her claims about the conspiracy, and assistance with financial resources that would support extended independence from Margaret and Caroline's control. These commitments represented significant personal and professional risks for Jennifer, whose decision to help demonstrated both loyalty to Victoria and courage in the face of circumstances that could easily be misunderstood or misrepresented. Victoria's transportation to Jennifer's apartment required additional strategic planning to avoid creating evidence trails that could facilitate tracking efforts. The taxi ride she arranged through cash payment and careful selection of pickup and destination locations provided necessary mobility while minimizing electronic records that could reveal her movements. Her instructions to the driver reflected growing sophistication and operational security considerations that would have been foreign to her thinking just hours earlier. The reunion with Jennifer marked Victoria's first experience of genuine human support since her hospitalization, providing emotional validation that contrasted sharply with the manipulative false care she had received from Margaret and Caroline. Jennifer's immediate acceptance of Victoria's claims and her willingness to provide assistance without extensive questioning or proof requirements demonstrated the kind of authentic loyalty that Victoria had thought she was receiving from her family members. The safe environment that Jennifer's apartment provided allowed Victoria to begin processing the psychological impact of her ordeal, while also planning the strategic response that would be necessary to protect herself from continued threats and seek justice for the crimes committed against her. The combination of immediate safety and trusted companionship created conditions that enabled Victoria to begin recovering her emotional equilibrium while maintaining the analytical focus that her circumstances continued to require. Victoria's first night of genuine freedom since her original accident represented both victory over her captors and recognition that her struggle for survival and justice was far from complete. Margaret and Caroline remained free to continue their conspiracy through alternative methods, and Victoria's escape had likely accelerated their timeline for implementing contingency plans that could eliminate the evidence of their crimes while removing the threat that her testimony represented to their freedom and financial goals. The woman who fell asleep in Jennifer's guest room that night was profoundly different from the trusting daughter who had walked into Margaret's house months earlier to help move furniture. Victoria had been transformed by betrayal and survival into someone capable of strategic thinking and decisive action under extreme pressure. Her apparent victimization had concealed the development of inner resources that would enable her not only to survive immediate threats, but to build the case for justice that her situation demanded. Victoria's first morning of genuine freedom in Jennifer Morrison's guest bedroom brought with it a complex mixture of relief, determination, and the sobering recognition that her escape represented merely the beginning of a far more challenging battle for justice and permanent safety. The physical sanctuary that Jennifer's apartment provided was essential for Victoria's immediate recovery, but the psychological sanctuary of being believed and supported by someone who understood the magnitude of her ordeal proved equally crucial to her ability to begin planning the comprehensive response that her circumstances demanded. Jennifer Morrison had served as Victoria's executive assistant for 3 years, during which their professional relationship had evolved into genuine mutual respect and understanding that extended beyond typical employer-employee boundaries. Jennifer possessed detailed knowledge of Victoria's business operations, personal habits, and character traits that enabled her to recognize immediately that the woman who had called for help was demonstrating mental clarity and strategic thinking entirely inconsistent with the cognitive impairment that Margaret and Caroline had been reporting to external contacts for months. The conversation that occurred over breakfast on Victoria's first morning of freedom established the foundation for what would become a comprehensive campaign to expose Margaret and Caroline's conspiracy while protecting Victoria from their continued threats. Jennifer approached the discussion with the same systematic thoroughness that had made her invaluable in managing Victoria's business affairs, asking detailed questions about the timeline of events, the evidence that Victoria had observed during her captivity, and the resources that would be necessary to build a compelling case for law enforcement and insurance investigators. Victoria's account of her ordeal revealed layers of criminal activity that extended far beyond the original assault, encompassing insurance fraud, financial exploitation, false imprisonment, and attempted murder through pharmaceutical means. The sophistication of Margaret and Caroline's conspiracy impressed Jennifer with its thoroughness, while simultaneously providing multiple avenues for investigation and prosecution that could ensure their eventual conviction and incarceration. The immediate priorities that emerged from this strategic planning session focused on securing Victoria's physical safety, documenting the evidence of criminal activity that she had observed during her captivity, and establishing communication with appropriate authorities who could provide protection while investigating the conspiracy. Each of these objectives required careful coordination to avoid compromising Victoria's security while building the strongest possible case for prosecution. Jennifer's professional network provided access to resources that Victoria could not have obtained independently, including legal representation from attorneys who specialized in complex fraud cases, private investigators with experience in insurance conspiracy matters, and security consultants who could assess the ongoing threats that Margaret and Caroline represented to Victoria's safety. The decision to engage these professionals required significant financial investment, but Jennifer's management of Victoria's business accounts during her supposed recovery had maintained cash flow that could support the extended legal battle that appeared inevitable. The documentation process that began on Victoria's second day of freedom required her to reconstruct months of observations and conversations with precision that would satisfy legal standards for evidence presentation. Jennifer served as both interviewer and recorder, using her knowledge of Victoria's communication patterns to ask questions that elicited the specific details that would be most useful for investigators and prosecutors. The sessions were emotionally exhausting for Victoria, requiring her to relive traumatic experiences while maintaining analytical focus on the strategic implications of each piece of information. The evidence that emerged from these documentation sessions painted a comprehensive picture of premeditated conspiracy that involved months of planning, systematic manipulation of medical and legal systems, and preparation for multiple murder attempts designed to appear accidental or medically related. Victoria's detailed recollections of overheard conversations provided direct evidence of criminal intent, while her observations of Margaret and Caroline's behavior patterns revealed the sophisticated nature of their deception and the extent of their preparation for implementing their conspiracy. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, whom Jennifer contacted through her network of professional relationships, brought 15 years of experience in complex fraud prosecution to Victoria's case. His initial assessment of the evidence that Victoria had gathered confirmed the strength of her claims, while also identifying the challenges that would need to be addressed to ensure successful prosecution. Rodriguez emphasized that insurance fraud cases required particularly compelling evidence due to the financial incentives that motivated false claims and the sophisticated nature of typical fraud schemes. The legal strategy that Rodriguez developed focused on building multiple parallel cases that would demonstrate the conspiracy from different perspectives and through various types of evidence. The attempted murder charges would rely primarily on Victoria's direct testimony about the original assault and the subsequent pharmaceutical poisoning attempt. The insurance fraud charges would be supported by documentation of the false claims and evidence of premeditation in purchasing the life insurance policy. The financial exploitation charges would be proven through analysis of the power of attorney arrangements and unauthorized access to Victoria's assets during her supposed incapacity. Private investigator Sandra Chen, who had worked previously with Rodriguez on insurance fraud cases, accepted responsibility for gathering independent corroboration of Victoria's claims and developing additional evidence that could strengthen the prosecution's case. Chen's background in forensic accounting and insurance investigation provided specialized expertise in analyzing the financial aspects of the conspiracy, while her connections within law enforcement enabled coordination with official investigations. The security assessment that consultant David Park conducted of Victoria's circumstances revealed significant ongoing threats that required immediate attention and long-term planning. Margaret and Caroline's awareness that Victoria had escaped and regained her cognitive abilities meant that they would likely attempt to eliminate her before she could expose their conspiracy to authorities. Park's recommendations included relocation to secure housing, implementation of communication security protocols, and coordination with law enforcement agencies that could provide protection during the investigation and prosecution phases. Victoria's business operations required careful management during this period to maintain cash flow, while avoiding activities that could compromise her security or interfere with the legal proceedings. Jennifer assumed greater responsibility for client relationships and project management, presenting Victoria's reduced availability as a continuation of her medical recovery, while actually facilitating her focus on the legal case that would determine her future safety and freedom. The psychological support that Victoria required during this period extended beyond the practical assistance that Jennifer and the professional team provided. The trauma of family betrayal combined with months of captivity and the ongoing threat of violence had created emotional damage that needed professional attention to prevent long-term psychological complications. Therapist Dr. Amanda Foster, who specialized in treating victims of domestic violence and family abuse, provided counseling services that helped Victoria process her experiences while maintaining the emotional stability necessary for effective participation in legal proceedings. Dr. Foster's assessment of Victoria's psychological state revealed remarkable resilience and adaptive capacity that had enabled her survival during extreme circumstances. The strategic thinking and emotional regulation that Victoria had developed during her captivity demonstrated inner resources that exceeded typical responses to trauma and suggested strong potential for complete psychological recovery. However, the ongoing nature of the threats she faced meant that her healing process would need to occur simultaneously, with continued vigilance and stress that could complicate traditional therapeutic approaches. The coordination with law enforcement that Rodriguez arranged through his professional contacts required careful timing and presentation to ensure that Victoria's claims would be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. Detective Lisa Martinez of the Phoenix Police Department's Fraud Division agreed to meet with Victoria and review the evidence that had been compiled during her first week of freedom. Martinez's experience with family violence cases provided relevant background for understanding the psychological dynamics that had enabled Margaret and Caroline's conspiracy to develop and persist undetected. Detective Martinez's initial interview with Victoria lasted 4 hours and covered every aspect of the conspiracy from the original insurance policy purchase through the final confrontation that had enabled Victoria's escape. Martinez's questions were thorough and occasionally challenging, reflecting her professional responsibility to assess the credibility of Victoria's claims while gathering information that could support criminal charges. The detective's conclusion that Victoria's account was consistent and compelling provided crucial validation for the legal strategy that Rodriguez had developed. The insurance investigation that Martinez coordinated with the fraud division of Victoria's insurance company revealed additional evidence that supported the criminal charges, while also protecting Victoria's legitimate claims for medical expenses related to her original injuries. Insurance investigator Robert Kim conducted an independent analysis of the original accident report and medical records that identified inconsistencies in Margaret's statements and timeline that had not been apparent during the initial claim processing. The medical evidence that Dr. Williams provided through her treatment records documented the extent of Victoria's original injuries, while also revealing the sophisticated nature of the medications that Margaret had attempted to administer during the final assault. The pharmaceutical analysis conducted by the police crime laboratory confirmed that the substances Margaret had prepared would have caused organ failure and death within hours, supporting the attempted murder charges while demonstrating the premeditated nature of the conspiracy. Victoria's transformation during this period of legal preparation and evidence gathering reflected the psychological healing that occurred when her circumstances aligned with her actual capabilities, and when she received genuine support from people who believed in her strength and intelligence. The contrast between her current environment of authentic assistance and the manipulative false care she had received from Margaret and Caroline illuminated the extent to which her family's betrayal had been designed to undermine her confidence and independence. The woman who emerged from this period of intensive preparation was fundamentally different from both the trusting daughter who had walked into Margaret's house and the apparently helpless victim who had maintained her deception during months of captivity. Victoria had developed strategic thinking capabilities, emotional resilience, and practical survival skills that would serve her throughout the legal proceedings ahead, while also providing resources for rebuilding her life and career once justice had been achieved. The foundation that Victoria and her support team established during this crucial period would prove essential for sustaining her through the challenges that lay ahead, as Margaret and Caroline implemented their own defensive strategies and attempted to discredit her claims through legal and personal attacks. The strength that Victoria had discovered within herself, combined with the authentic loyalty and professional expertise of her allies, created conditions that would enable her not only to survive her family's betrayal but to transform the experience into a source of wisdom and capability that would define the remainder of her life. The systematic investigation into Margaret and Caroline's conspiracy entered a critical phase during Victoria's third week of freedom, as the evidence-gathering process began to reveal the broader network of deception and manipulation that had enabled their attempted murder to proceed undetected for months. The professional team that Victoria had assembled worked with methodical precision to document every aspect of the criminal enterprise, but their investigation also uncovered disturbing revelations about the extent to which other individuals had been manipulated or compromised by Margaret's sophisticated psychological strategies. Detective Lisa Martinez coordinated her official police investigation with the private research efforts that Sandra Chen was conducting, creating a comprehensive examination of the conspiracy that extended far beyond the immediate criminal charges. The financial records that Chen analyzed revealed complex patterns of manipulation that had been implemented gradually over the 3 years since Robert Hayes's death, demonstrating that Margaret's planning for Victoria's elimination had begun much earlier than anyone had previously suspected. The banking records that Chen obtained through legal subpoenas showed systematic redirection of Victoria's business income during her supposed recovery period, with Margaret and Caroline accessing approximately $300,000 through their power of attorney arrangements. The unauthorized transactions included payments to individuals and organizations that appeared unrelated to Victoria's medical care or business operations, suggesting that the financial exploitation had been used to fund additional aspects of their conspiracy that investigators had not yet identified. Dr. Patricia Williams, whose medical records provided crucial documentation of Victoria's original injuries and subsequent treatment, agreed to cooperate fully with the police investigation, despite the professional embarrassment that her involvement represented. Williams acknowledged that her assessment of Margaret as an exemplary caregiver had been based primarily on superficial indicators rather than comprehensive evaluation of the family dynamics or independent verification of Victoria's actual condition during home visits. The medical testimony that Dr. Williams provided revealed important details about the pharmaceutical substances that Margaret had attempted to administer during the final assault. The combination of medications that Margaret had prepared would have interacted synergistically to cause rapid organ failure, while mimicking natural complications from traumatic brain injury. The sophistication of this pharmaceutical knowledge suggested either extensive research or consultation with medical professionals who understood the specific effects of drug interactions on patients recovering from neurological trauma. Jennifer Morrison's analysis of Victoria's business communications during the recovery period uncovered additional evidence of Margaret and Caroline's systematic isolation strategy. Email correspondence had been carefully filtered to prevent Victoria's clients and associates from developing concerns about her extended absence or questioning the family's management of her affairs. The communication patterns revealed coordination between Margaret and Caroline in crafting responses that maintained professional relationships while discouraging direct contact or independent verification of Victoria's condition. The investigation into Margaret's background revealed psychological and financial pressures that provided context for understanding the development of her murderous conspiracy. Private investigator Sandra Chen discovered that Margaret had accumulated substantial debts during the years following Robert's death, including credit card obligations and household expenses that exceeded her fixed income from insurance and Social Security benefits. The financial analysis suggested that Margaret had been living beyond her means for approximately 2 years before implementing the plan to eliminate Victoria for insurance money. Carolyn's financial situation presented similar pressures that explained her willingness to participate in her sister's murder. Chen's research revealed that Caroline and David Chen had been experiencing significant economic stress related to their children's private school expenses, medical bills for David's aging parents, and mortgage payments on a home that had been purchased based on optimistic projections of David's earning potential in pediatric nursing. The $2 million insurance policy represented not just opportunity, but apparent necessity for resolving their accumulated financial obligations. The psychological evaluation that Dr. Amanda Foster conducted of the evidence and testimony provided insights into the mental processes that had enabled Margaret and Caroline to justify attempted murder. Foster's analysis suggested that both women had developed elaborate rationalization systems that portrayed Victoria's success as somehow illegitimate or harmful to family welfare, making her elimination seem reasonable or even necessary for protecting other family members. Attorney Michael Rodriguez used this psychological analysis to develop prosecution strategies that would demonstrate the premeditated nature of the conspiracy while addressing potential defense arguments about mental incapacity or temporary emotional disturbance. Rodriguez emphasized that the sophisticated planning and systematic implementation of the conspiracy demonstrated clear understanding of moral and legal boundaries, precluding insanity defenses or claims of diminished responsibility. The insurance company's internal investigation, coordinated through investigator Robert Kim, revealed additional instances of suspicious claims and questionable circumstances that suggested Margaret might have been involved in other fraudulent activities prior to the conspiracy against Victoria. Kim's analysis of Margaret's insurance history identified patterns of claims, timing, and circumstances that warranted further investigation, potentially establishing a broader pattern of criminal behavior that could strengthen the prosecution's case. The media attention that began to develop around Victoria's case created additional complications that required careful management to protect her safety while building public awareness that could support the prosecution efforts. Rodriguez worked with Victoria and Jennifer to develop communication strategies that would control the narrative surrounding the case, while avoiding premature disclosure of evidence that could compromise the legal proceedings. Victoria's decision to grant a carefully planned interview with investigative journalist Maria Santos of the Arizona Republic provided an opportunity to present her story directly to the public while maintaining control over the information that was disclosed. Santos's background in covering complex criminal cases and her reputation for thorough, accurate reporting made her an ideal partner for ensuring that Victoria's account would be presented fairly and comprehensively. The public response to Victoria's story revealed both support and skepticism that reflected common assumptions about family relationships and the difficulty that many people experienced in accepting that mothers and sisters could be capable of such calculated betrayal. The supportive responses provided Victoria with emotional validation and practical assistance, while the skeptical reactions demonstrated the challenges that prosecutors would face in convincing juries of the extraordinary nature of Margaret and Caroline's conspiracy. The security threats that emerged following the media coverage required intensification of the protective measures that David Park had implemented around Victoria's living situation and daily activities. Park's assessment indicated that Margaret and Caroline remained dangerous and were likely developing contingency plans for eliminating Victoria before she could testify against them in criminal proceedings. The security protocols that Park established included relocation to a safe house facility, implementation of electronic surveillance detection procedures, and coordination with law enforcement agencies for rapid response to potential threats. Victoria's business operations faced significant challenges during this period, as the media attention and legal proceedings created uncertainty about her availability and focus on professional responsibilities. Jennifer Morrison managed client relationships with exceptional skill, maintaining service quality, while gradually transitioning some accounts to other marketing firms that could provide the intensive attention that Victoria's situation prevented her from offering during the legal proceedings. The psychological impact of the media attention and public scrutiny added another layer of stress to Victoria's recovery process, requiring additional therapeutic support from Dr. Foster to maintain emotional stability during the increasingly complex legal and public relations challenges. Foster's assessment indicated that Victoria was demonstrating remarkable resilience, but emphasized the importance of maintaining therapeutic support throughout the extended legal proceedings that could last for many months. Detective Martinez's investigation revealed connections between Margaret's conspiracy and other individuals who had provided assistance or consultation that enabled the sophisticated aspects of the plan. The pharmaceutical knowledge that Margaret had demonstrated suggested consultation with medical professionals who might not have understood the criminal purposes for which their expertise was being used. Martinez coordinated with professional licensing boards to investigate whether any healthcare providers had violated ethical or legal obligations through their interactions with Margaret. The forensic accounting analysis that Sandra Chen conducted revealed additional financial irregularities that suggested Margaret had been preparing for the conspiracy much longer than previously understood. Bank records showed gradual liquidation of assets and strategic positioning of finances that would facilitate rapid access to insurance proceeds following Victoria's death. The planning timeline appeared to extend back nearly 18 months, indicating far more sophisticated preparation than the investigation had initially revealed. Caroline's cooperation attempts, which began during her 4th week following Victoria's escape, provided crucial insider information about the conspiracy, while also revealing the psychological pressure and fear that had motivated her participation. Caroline's attorney arranged proffer sessions with prosecutors in which she detailed Margaret's manipulation tactics and timeline for implementing the murder plan, though her credibility remained questionable due to her direct participation in the attempted murder. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.